For more than 20 years, the world knew only one pharaoh of Egypt, and it wasn't him. His name appeared on temple walls, but always behind a greater name. He wore the crown, but the real power belonged to the woman seated on the higher throne. But when that woman vanished from history, the child in the shadows became something no one expected, a conquering king, a strategist whose every march, 3,000 years later, is still studied step by step. This is the story of Thutmose III. Around 1479 BCE, in Thebes, the seat of Egyptian power, Pharaoh Thutmose II died. His successor was a child only a few years old, his son by a secondary wife named Iset. That child was given the throne name, Thutmose III. But a king who is only a few years old cannot rule a country. So following royal tradition, the one who stepped in as regent was his stepmother, Queen Hatshepsut. Except Hatshepsut was not content to remain a regent. She did something no woman in Egyptian history had done before. She declared herself pharaoh, not regent, not queen consort, but king, with the full titles, imagery, and authority of a male ruler. Thutmose III was still recorded as king. His name still appeared on monuments. But in every carving, every ritual, every decision, Hatshepsut stood first. He was only a shadow, 22 years. That is how long Thutmose III lived under his stepmother's shadow. But history has left us one important clue. It's quite possible that Hatshepsut herself was the one who gave Thutmose III command of the Egyptian army as one of his duties. While she ran the government, built temples, and expanded trade, the young prince quietly learned how to command an army. No one knew, not even Hatshepsut, that she was training the very man who would write the empire's most brilliant chapter. And then, in 1458 BCE, Hatshepsut died. For the first time in his life, Thutmose III stood alone on the throne of Egypt. No shadow stood before him anymore. But news of Hatshepsut's death didn't stay within Egypt's borders. It spread all the way to the Levant, the lands that are today Israel, Palestine, and Syria, where dozens of small city-states were still paying tribute to Egypt. To them, this was an opportunity. A coalition of Canaanite city-states, led by the king of Kadesh and backed by the powerful Mitanni Empire to the north, began gathering its forces. They believed that this new pharaoh, a man who had never once led an army into battle alone, who had spent 22 years living in a woman's shadow, would not have the resolve to strike back. They were wrong. This is the story of the first battle in human history to be recorded in step-by-step detail, the Battle of Megiddo, 1457 BCE. And we know everything that follows, not from legend, but from one man, an army scribe named Janeni. Janeni accompanied Thutmose III throughout the campaign, recording each day, each decision, each number, on leather scrolls. Years later, those records were carved onto the walls of the Temple of Amun-Re at Karnak, and they survive to this day. Thanks to him, we know the Egyptian army, somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 men, including infantry, archers, and charioteers, marched 150 miles in just 10 days. They rested at Gaza, then advanced to the town of Yehem. And there, Thutmose III stopped to do something an inexperienced king rarely does. He called a council of war. Before him lay 3 roads to Megiddo. 2 were wide, safe, and easy to march on. 1, the road through Aruna, was so narrow that the army would have to march single file, one man at a time. His generals all argued against that road, They had intelligence that the enemy was waiting at the far end of the narrow pass. And if the army took that route, the vanguard would reach the enemy while the rear guard was still miles behind, unable to reinforce in time. It was a potential death trap. Any cautious commander would have chosen the safe road. But Thutmose III answered with words carved word for word onto the walls of Karnak, one of the rare sayings of a pharaoh that survives to this day. Recorded by his own scribe, "I swear, as Ra loves me, as my father Amun favors me, as my nostrils are rejuvenated with life and satisfaction, my majesty shall proceed upon this Aruna road." He did not choose the safe road. He chose the one road no one believed an army would dare take. And for exactly that reason, no one was waiting there. This wasn't the impulsiveness of a young king trying to prove himself. This was the first recorded act of military psychology in history. An enemy always prepares for the most reasonable move. So the most unreasonable move becomes the strongest weapon. The Egyptian army passed through the gorge safely, without a single loss, and emerged right at the foot of Megiddo, exactly where and exactly when the Canaanite coalition least expected them. The battle began. The Egyptian army shattered. The Canaanite coalition's formation right on the field before the city. But then something unexpected happened. Something historians still cite today as a classic lesson. The enemy fled into the city, abandoning their entire camp full of riches. And the Egyptian soldiers, in the middle of winning, stopped to loot the spoils. Instead of pursuing the enemy and sealing the city gates. That mistake gave the enemy enough time to shut the gates and dig in. Megiddo, which might have fallen in a single day, now endured a siege that lasted 7 months. But in the end, the city surrendered. And with the victory at Megiddo, Thutmose III didn't just regain control of Canaan. He proved to the entire world something undeniable. The child in the shadows had become a commander no one could afford to underestimate. This was only the first campaign of what would become at least 14, possibly as many as 17, campaigns over the next 20 years. After Megiddo, Thutmose III didn't stop. Year after year, he led his armies back into the Levant, seizing key port cities like Byblos, taking control of Damascus, securing his hold over Kadesh. He even built something that had never existed in the Egyptian military before. A true naval fleet, the first known combat navy in the ancient world, to move troops faster along the Levantine coast. And then came the most ambitious campaign of his life. A confrontation with the Mitanni Empire, a powerful force in Mesopotamia, on the far side of the Euphrates River. To pull this off, Thutmose III ordered his army to carry boats overland, across hundreds of miles of desert, so they could cross the river the moment they needed to. He became the only pharaoh in Egyptian history to ever lead an army across the Euphrates. That victory sent shockwaves across the ancient Near East. Other major powers, Babylonia, Assyria, and even the Hittites, were forced to recognize Egypt's dominance in the region. Meanwhile, in the south, Thutmose III kept pushing his control deep into Nubia, past the Nile's cataracts, with some sources placing his reach as far as the Fourth Cataract, others further still. Unlike the north, where Egypt mostly kept watch through garrisons, Nubia was fully annexed and directly governed by an Egyptian official known as the Viceroy of Kush. Once it was all in place, Thutmose III's empire stretched farther than at any other point in ancient Egyptian history, from the Euphrates River in the northeast, through the entire Levant, deep down into Nubia in the south. This wasn't just seasonal raiding, the way many kings before him had operated. This was an empire run as a system. Thutmose III had a particularly clever strategy. He allowed defeated local rulers to keep governing their own lands, but brought their sons back to Egypt to be educated. Those princes grew up immersed in Egyptian culture, learning loyalty to the pharaoh. And when the time came for them to return home and take their father's place, they came back with hearts that already belonged to Egypt. It was a form of imperial control smarter than anything Egypt had ever attempted before. Conquest, not just by the sword, but by an entire generation. But there is one chapter in Thutmose III's story that historians still debate to this day. After Hatshepsut's death, many of her monuments, carvings, and inscriptions were chiseled away from structures across Egypt. For centuries, people believed this was an act of revenge, that Thutmose III, after 22 years in his stepmother's shadow, decided to erase all memory of the woman who had once taken the throne from him. But here is the important part. Modern researchers don't fully agree with that explanation anymore. There is evidence that this erasure didn't happen immediately after Hatshepsut's death, but rather later, possibly for other political or religious reasons, not necessarily as an immediate act of personal revenge. The truth, like much of ancient history, isn't as simple as a dramatic revenge story. We cannot know for certain what truly went through Thutmose III's mind when he confronted the legacy of the woman who had overshadowed him for 2 decades. One thing is certain: whatever the motive, history ultimately remembers his name, not only because of his relationship to her, but because of what he achieved on his own, alone, after that shadow was gone. Over 54 years on the throne, counting the years under Hatshepsut's shadow, Thutmose III turned Egypt from a regional kingdom into the most powerful empire the ancient world had known up to that point. He was not only a warrior. Much of the wealth from his campaigns went into construction, especially the Temple of Amun-Re at Karnak, where his own victories were carved into the walls so future generations would never forget them. In his 50th year as king, he carried out his final military campaign, once again toward Nubia. 2 years before his death, after the death of his eldest son Amenemhat, Thutmose III chose another son, Amenhotep II, to serve as co-regent, securing the succession. Around 1425 BCE, Thutmose III died. Historian Richard A. Gabriel, looking back at his entire military career, undefeated across nearly 20 campaigns, called him the Napoleon of Egypt. But there is one crucial difference between the two men. Napoleon, in the end, was defeated and exiled. Thutmose III was not. For 22 years, the world saw only a shadow standing behind the throne. But they forgot something. Those who stand in the shadows the longest are often the ones who see the light most clearly when their moment finally comes. Thutmose III didn't just become pharaoh. He redefined the limits of what a pharaoh could achieve. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe to join me as we explore the next pages of history. Your companionship is a great source of motivation for us. See you next time.